Good morning, everyone. I think all of us have been in situations where we had to talk to somebody about something we really didn't want to talk to them about. We wish that it had never occurred. It never had happened like that. Maybe you're an employer and you have to fire maybe an employee or talk to them about something that you're uncomfortable, but they have to be talked to about. Or maybe you are an employee and you have to talk to your boss, or you might have to tell your boss that you're leaving, and you just dread it. You dread maybe having to say something to your children, to your parents, or whatever the case may be. I heard a story about a man who never married, but he had this cat that he just loved dearly named Tibbles. And he was going on a cruise, and he entrusted the cat to his brother and his brother's wife while he was on the cruise. Well, on the first day of the cruise, he called back, and the first question he asked was, "How's Tibbles?" His brother said, "Tibbles died." The man was crushed. He said, "I can't believe that you put it to me like that." He said, "That's heartless. Don't you have any tact at all?" And the brother said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, I could have called and you could have told me that Tibbles was on the roof and we can't get him down. And then I could have called back the next day and you could have said, well, Tibbles fell off the roof and he's going to have to, but he's going to be okay. And then the third day I could have called back and you could have said, Tibbles needed surgery, but we think everything's fine. And then I could have called back on the fourth day and you could have said, well, Tibbles didn't make it. You could have prepared me for the shock. The brother said, well, I'm sorry. And he said, well, that's okay. He said, how's mom? And his brother said, well, she's on the roof and we can't get her down. Well, there are conversations like that. They're just hard for us to have, aren't they? And we don't know how to say it best, to tell you the truth, like the brother sometimes. And sometimes, especially, we have to confront somebody about sin. I've had to do this several times as a minister and as an elder in the church. I've had to go and talk to people about sin that they were committing. And it's not easy. There's a story told about a minister that lived about 150, almost 200 years ago by the name of Peter Cartwright. And the leaders of his congregation came up to him one time and they said, President Andrew Jackson is going to be at services today. Don't say anything that will offend him. And so the first three sentences of Peter Cartwright's sermon that morning was, I understand that that President Andrew Jackson is in the audience today. The leaders of this congregation have asked me to be guarded with my words. Andrew Jackson is going to hell if he doesn't repent. Well, the congregation is just aghast. But after the services, Andrew Jackson made his way up to this minister and he shook his hand and he said, if I had a regiment full of men just like you, he said, I could whip the world. Well, I want to tell you about another man who would be just like that. He would confront you if your sin was serious enough. He would confront you just like this minister did, you might say, to President Andrew Jackson. Formerly, his name was Saul of Tarsus to the Jews. But when we come to meet him and talk about him today, he'll be known as the Apostle Paul to the non-Jews. And Paul was particularly in Peter's face, we're going to see today, about how to be justified by faith. He's going to be he's still talking about the gospel. We've been studying the gospel. This whole letter is about the gospel. You remember that Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey had gone up into this area that's today Asia Minor or Turkey, and they had started churches up there. And many of these people, many of these believers were not Jewish. Remember, the church started in Jerusalem, which was almost exclusively Jewish at the time. And so many that's where the church started. So everybody who when the church started was Jewish. But anyway, eventually it spread, very quickly it spread to people who were not Jews. And when Paul and Barnabas went on this trip, they started churches that were non-Jewish. And so at this time, now you remember Paul has already met privately with Peter in Jerusalem and the other apostles to make sure that they wouldn't be a hindrance to his message of preaching the gospel. But now, I would say probably it's just after that, but some people would say this happened later, but don't worry about the time. It's another incident when Paul writes what he does here in verses 11 through 14. He says, when Cephas, that's another name for Peter, the apostle Peter, by the way. Now, when he came to Antioch, now remember, Paul, in the first 10 verses of this chapter, had met with Peter and the other apostles in Jerusalem. So Peter's a Jew, Paul's a Jew. They met in Jerusalem, which is all Jews. But now Peter comes to Antioch, where Paul and Barnabas were working with people who were non-Jewish. And so, but there were Jews in the congregation as well. And so here's what he says to Peter. He said, when he came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, Peter, in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a non-Jew, a Gentile, and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles, non-Jews, to follow Jewish customs? And so Peter was eating with non-Jews in Antioch, a non-Jewish city. But then when some people came from Jerusalem who were Jewish, some of the circumcision group, he calls them, that means they were Jews, he drew back. And he wouldn't eat with them because, Jews at that time, they were very prejudiced against this dominant group of Romans or non-Jews. And so Paul is going to show us that his actions contradicted his what he knew to be true. And so we read here in these verses, he calls Peter a couple of different times. He calls him a hypocrite. This was hypocrisy, what happened. Far more surprising that Peter stopped eating with non-Jews was that he ever ate with them in the first place. That would have been the most surprising thing to people who had come down from Jerusalem. In other words, Peter wasn't acting out of his convictions. Peter knew better as well. He knew, just like Paul said, he knew he was acting like a hypocrite. The word hypocrite means to pretend or to act. An actor is a hypocrite. You see, they're acting out someone else's emotions and actions that they're not their own. You might have this love scene and someone says, I love you, and they hug each other, and well, they don't really love that person, and they really don't want that person to marry them. They're just acting, they're pretending. And you can say being hypocrites. Well, that's what people do sometimes, isn't it, when they come into the Lord's church? They act like something that they're not. They're pretending. And so Peter, he knew better than this. And Jesus had taught him better than this. Listen to this. In Mark chapter 7, during the ministry of Jesus, Jesus said in these verses, nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. So it's not what you eat. It's what comes out of you, and these sins of the heart that Jesus talks about. And that was just verse 15 out of those verses. But Jesus wasn't the only one that taught Peter this. In fact, God taught him the same thing, even about non-Jews. In Acts chapter 10, Peter had visions, 3 visions that God sent to him because he wanted him to go and preach to a non-Jewish person, a man by the name of Cornelius. Well, Peter kept refusing, but finally he went. And here's what he says at the end of chapter 10. He said, "You are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate or visit a non-Jew. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean." So God also taught him something. And then when Peter gets back from baptizing Cornelius and eating with Cornelius, he was a non-Jew, and he was brought into the family of God. Cornelius who was a non-Jew. Well, Peter had to go back up to Jerusalem. And when he got back up to Jerusalem, well, all these Jewish Christians, they called Peter in on the carpet, and they wanted him to explain himself. And so he tells them about these visions that he had. He tells them about the experience that he had with Cornelius. And he concludes in verses 34 and 35 to this very large group of Jews in Jerusalem. He says, "I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right." So you see, God had taught him this. And then later on, now they're going to have Paul and Barnabas are going to go and start these churches in Galatia. A lot of them aren't going to be Jews. And then, of course, there are a lot of people going back in behind them and saying, "Hey, you got to become a Jew if you really want to be a saved person. We're going to add to the gospel requirements that aren't in the gospel." And so this became an issue in Antioch. And what does Paul do? He goes to Jerusalem, and they settle this matter in Jerusalem. And here's what Peter said in Jerusalem. He said, "God did not discriminate between us and them." He's talking about us and the non-Jews, them. "For he purified their hearts by faith." That's how they were saved, not by becoming Jews. Their hearts were purified by faith. "Now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of non-Jews a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors have been able to bear? No, we believe it is through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ that we are saved, just like them." This is really interesting. Now, you got to remember, Peter is in Jerusalem when he uttered those words right there in front of an almost entirely Jewish audience. And he says, "Hey, we're saved just like them." He could have said, "They're saved just like us." But I think the wording here, it's always astounded me for a couple of decades or more. He says, "No, you know what? We Jews are saved just like they are." And I think that's very telling in itself. So why was Peter acting the way he was? Well, he was acting, first of all, out of fear. This isn't the first time Peter has lost his courage. You remember on the night that Jesus was crucified, you remember he ran. He lost his courage at that point as well. And you remember now, at other times, I can't think right now, but he was afraid. The bottom line is that he was afraid. He was afraid of these people who were a part of, here in verse 12, the circumcision group. Now, what makes a Jew, if you're a man, is circumcision. And so all Jews, Jewish men, are circumcised. That's what defines them as Jewish. That's one of the things that defines them as Jewish. And these Jewish, they were false brothers, but they were going in behind Paul into Galatians saying, oh, you got to be circumcised. You got to become a Jew. You got to observe all of our dietary laws and our rituals and everything if you want to really be a believer. And then God saves you by grace if you do everything right. Well, Paul said no. And this is why he's really angry in this letter. We pointed that out in our first sermons on Galatians. He's mad, and he's fighting that all the way through this letter. There's no letter really like it where he gets this confrontational. He's angry about some stuff. So this circumcision group, though, is just a way of describing these people who believe salvation through Christ plus something else. Now, if you're part of our live service, we sang the song, Nothing But the Blood. And that word nothing is mentioned over and over and over again in that song. It's nothing but the blood of Jesus. It's not nothing but the blood of Jesus plus. It's nothing but. It's not Christ plus. You can't add to grace and still be grace. We talk about this all the time. Paul said in Romans 11, verse 6, if it's by grace, it's no longer by works, because if it's by works, it would no longer be grace. You cannot add to grace and works to grace, and it still be grace. And so these people here were adding to the gospel of God's grace. And they were putting pressure on him, and he was fearful. Now, I want to tell you something. I have a lot of experience with this in my own life, but I've seen it in many examples throughout my lifetime. But legalists, people who try to add law keeping to salvation, they are very good at the politics of intimidation. And legalists, this is what we call people like that who say, no, you're saved by your works. One principle that, they use different things. They use pressure. They insist upon things. They threaten if they don't get their way. And it usually works something like this. If they think, you're not in line with us and the rules that we've made. Now, they're not in the gospel, these rules, but they're saying, no, you got to do it this way. And so, first of all, they might just chat with you about it. And it might be a friendly chat at first. And if they think we need to add a few warnings and remind them of what happens to people like that if they don't, toe the line with us, remember, what's happened. We wouldn't want that to happen to you. The Catholic Church has these people who they have a large percentage of their priests are pedophiles. And so the church goes to these people who are going to expose some priests for raping a child. And they'll go up to them and say, now, don't say anything about it. It would be embarrassing to the church, the Catholic Church. And so they're real nice to them at first and try to shame them into something. And then if that doesn't work, the next thing they do, and all legalist groups, I'm giving you an example of Catholics because I've got a lot of examples in Catholics as well. But I'm telling you, all these works groups, I don't care if you're Jehovah's Witness or what, Mormons, the group I came out of, they're all the same, all works groups. They're real nice to you at first. They talk to you. And then if they can see you're not coming along, then they threaten you. Like the Roman Catholic Church says, I'll tell you what, we will destroy you. We are powerful, and they are. We got lots of money, and we got a lot of influence, and we will destroy you if you come out with this. And of course, some people try to do it anyway, but then they are shunned. If you still insist upon exposing us or not living the way we want you to, where we control you, well, then what we're going to do is we're going to destroy you. And they try to too. They will slander you. Your family and friends will shun you. That's what happens in these works-based groups. It's because when you start adding to God's gospel, well, then you got to be able to control people. and you want to shame people. I could tell you a lot of stories. There was a group up, I preached in this group, baptized this young lady, and several other young people in that congregation. And she wore pants every day. But this congregation, man, you didn't do that at church or let any of the other people at church see you if you were a girl wearing pants. Well, she wore them every day. And one day she came to church because she was going to be late, but she still wanted to go to the service on Wednesday night. And she came in pants that she had been wearing to school. And all of her friends unfriended her on Facebook that were part of that religious group the next morning when she woke up. And it happens all the time. I've had, on several occasions, I've had leaders of a congregation, up to 15 or 20, all pile in against me. And on another occasion, I remember 3 or 4, and they all came to talk to me about, well, you can't go see this church anymore because we've decided, our religious group has decided, that they're godly people. But we've decided that we're not going to have anything to do with them anymore. So what are you going to do, Jimmy? And they threaten. And they're supporting you financially. And you know what happens? You either say, okay, and you cave in and you keep your support, or you say, no, there's nothing wrong with them. They're godly people. And you should want me, if they weren't godly, to go preach to them, not keep me from preaching to them. I'm a preacher. That's what I do. I told them, I said, I would go and preach to Muslims, Jews. I do it. I'll preach to anyone. I'm a preacher. You should want me to go, not try to, keep me away. But what happens is they say, well, you don't agree. You don't get your support anymore. Okay. But you see what people do. The pressure's there all the time. And I could just tell you story after story like this. Well, Peter knew how it worked. He lived in Jerusalem. And this was a very important issue with everybody in Jerusalem. So he's worried about what, now when he talks about it in Jerusalem, theoretically, everything's hunky-dory because there aren't any non-Jews up there that they have to really do anything with. But I'll tell you what, when he goes down to Antioch, it's not Jewish. There are very few Jews. There's a small minority. And now he's got to make a decision. He's worried what they're going to say when they go back up to the main church. I have a friend, a very good friend, and he has understood that he's saved by grace like me, but he was raised just like me. And he said his brother was a minister in this religious group that him and I grew up in for many years. And he studied with his brother and taught him the gospel, how that we're saved by grace through faith, not by works of any kind, Paul would say. And he taught him this, and he said his brother could see that and agreed with him. Well, guess what? When his religious group found out that he believed that, my friend says that 35 preachers from that group had a sit down with him. They met him in the church building, and he said his brother caved in. He gave in to those 35 preachers. Everything was hunky-dory, you see. When it was just him and his brother talking about grace, he can understand it. But boy, I'll tell you what, when Peter has to go back up to Jerusalem and everybody up there, this is a very important issue to Jews. It has been since birth for generations. Now you got to make a decision. You're worried what they're going to say about you in Jerusalem. And of course, they can reason with Peter and say, now, listen, Peter, we're trying to save these non-saved Jews. And if you do that, we're going to have a hard time, preaching the gospel to these Jews up in Jerusalem who aren't saved. You see, they can, Satan's got all these tactics. But Paul says they were acting like hypocrites. And Paul said, even Barnabas, who was also a Jew who worked with Paul, and he had been working with Paul, and they were saving people who were not Jewish, he even joined in with the hypocrisy. And, we won't eat. We won't associate with you. In other words, we won't fellowship you. We won't accept you as true believers. And so Paul said, basically, he said, I stood up to Peter and I said, let me tell you about the time that or he's telling these Gentiles that I got in the face of Peter about grace. Now, one of the problems was fear, and these were legalists. Another problem was racial pride. Racial pride entered into this. You see, Peter and the Jews of this generation, and almost every generation in history, it seems like for thousands of years, the Jews have been a minority. Now, the Jews, they hate, even today, the Jews, they marry Jews. And the different religious Jewish groups marry into but they will not marry a non-Jew, even today. They are very prejudiced against people who aren't Jews. But back then, they hated intensely the dominant majority that ruled the world, the Romans. They teach this hatred all the time. They always have stories they can tell about the dominant group, and they just hate them. And a lot of those stories probably aren't even true, but you know what? They want to hear it, and they want to hear it that way, and they tell us. And of course, that's the way it is with many minorities today. You can live, let's say, in America, and you can really have a great life if you just join in. The Jews could have had a wonderful, prosperous, peaceful life in a law-abiding Roman world where there was law and order. You can travel all over the world, and you don't have to worry about things. But they hated the Romans, the dominant group. And a lot of people today, you can have these minorities, they just hate, it seems like, America. Well, guess what? You could just get along and enjoy it. And everybody, would live peacefully and prosperously. But that was what was going on here. Racial pride. Now, this is the problem. This racial pride and prejudice works its way into the church. Because I don't care who you are, whatever culture you're in is going to influence you as well if you're a believer in your congregation. So Paul saw something that was going on that was much deeper than this. And he saw the main problem that they all had was that they weren't living in line with the truth of the gospel, the good news message about Christ. Literally, what Paul says is Peter was not ortho walking. When he says in line with the truth, that word literally is ortho walking. The prefix ortho means straight. You go to an orthodontist, you see, to make your teeth straight. And so the first thing that really you learn about this statement right here, the most obvious thing about this statement is the good news message about Jesus is a truth. In other words, it's a claim, it's a set of claims. That's what the good news message is. And this has implications for all of life. It's our job to make sure that we are living in line. We're in line, we're lined up with the truth of the good news message. Because if we're not, it's going to express itself in our behavior, like with Peter. If you don't have a correct understanding of the good news message, you're not going to act out in line with the gospel. You're not going to live like that. That's what Paul is saying. And so there's a lot of examples like this that we could give in life around us. But this is something that happens. We still see it today. And so Paul says to his face, by the way, not behind his back, he said, you're a hypocrite. This is hypocritical acting. And to be a hypocrite, too, it's to speak under someone. And so as I said, it has to do with acting. An actor would act out someone else's intentions or words or actions and so forth. So how does this work today? How does hypocrisy work today? When you try to add rules to the gospel of God's grace, what you cause in your organization is a bunch of hypocrites. Because what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of people who don't believe those rules. They don't really believe those rules are wrong or a sin if you kept it or didn't keep the rule. But you know what they're going to do? They're going to pretend that they think they're wrong, and they're going to act like they think that the rules that the group lives by are wrong. So what do? We act like it's wrong. We pretend something is wrong that we really don't believe is wrong, because we don't want to upset the legalists who make those rules, who want it to be wrong. And that's what's going on. That's what happens when you add works to the good news message about Christ. The good news about God's grace. Paul put it this way: my only goal, and we see it in this letter, he says, this is my only aim in life. And I've made this my only aim in life too. Paul is my mentor. And Paul, and years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I just really had an impression on me. I thought, well, man, if that's Paul's only aim, I'm going to make that my only aim. And Paul says, my only aim is to preach the good news of God's grace. It's a good news message. It's a set of claims. It's a message. It's news, not commands, news about Jesus. And he said, that's my only aim. And I'll tell you what, this is really important too on how Paul handled this. And I really think that before I came to know grace, I probably failed at this numerous times, and maybe even after coming to know grace. You could probably, if you examine my life every minute, every day, find times. But this is really a great example by Paul. Because what Paul could have done is said, man, you're not acting right. You've got pride, and you're arrogant, and attack Peter, and he'd been right about all those things. But instead, what does Paul do? He confronts him with the good news message about Christ. Talks to him about the gospel, how he's behaving isn't in line with the good news about Jesus. And that's really how that we ought to approach everything and everybody in life. This is a really great example. It's real easy to say, you're prejudiced, and prejudice is a sin, Peter. Just leave it at that. Or, you're prideful. You're a hypocrite. Or you could show him why, because of the gospel, he's not living in line with this good news message. So we'll stop there today, and God willing, I know usually I teach one Lord's Day on Galatians, and then the next Lord's Day on this series about being what God wants us to be. But I'll probably try to finish up the rest of this chapter, verses 15 through 21, next Lord's Day, God willing. So we will stop here.